In 1997, Ellen DeGeneres and Dern made television history. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, the ABC network initiated a brutal corporate execution. The executives used Ellen's real life coming out to sell millions in advertising, but the exact second conservative sponsors threatened to pull their money, the network turned on them. They slapped hazard warnings on the show, quietly canceled it, and blacklisted both women from Hollywood. This is erased by the network. Today we expose the cruel, calculated reality behind television's most historic kiss and how a corporation sold human rights for cash. This trap was not an accident. It was the direct result of the mid-1990s television business. The industry was not a place for social experiments. It was a highly conservative, well-oiled corporate machine designed to do one thing: keep viewers sitting on their sofas so companies could sell them cars, soap, and cereal. Sitcoms were supposed to be safe and traditional. Ellen DeGeneres was the star of a highly profitable show for ABC, but by its fourth season, the ratings were slipping. The writers were running out of ideas, and the audience was slowly drifting away. Behind the scenes, Ellen was buckling under a massive psychological weight. She was hiding her true identity from the world, playing a sanitized, strictly heterosexual version of herself on screen, while keeping her real life a closely guarded secret. The stress of this double life was becoming unbearable. She went to the network executives with a request. She wanted her character to come out. She wanted the television show to reflect her actual reality. Initially, the executives at ABC flatly refused. They were terrified. In their eyes, Ellen was not a human being asking for the right to be authentic. She was a corporate asset that was about to malfunction. They feared that middle America would turn the channel. They feared that religious groups would protest. Most importantly, they feared that their highly conservative corporate sponsors would pull their advertising money. The network bosses told her to stay quiet and keep delivering the safe, traditional jokes they were paying her for. But Hollywood is a town built on leaks, and soon rumors started circulating in the press that Ellen's character might come out. The media reaction was instantaneous and massive. Newspapers put the story on the front page. Talk shows debated it. The public curiosity reached a boiling point. And when the television executives saw the sheer volume of press coverage, their fear completely vanished, replaced entirely by greed. The executives looked at the spreadsheets and did the cold, hard math of television capitalism. They realized that the controversy was not a threat. It was a goldmine. They knew that millions of people who had stopped watching the show would tune back in just to see what happened. That massive spike in viewership meant the network could charge absolute top dollar for the commercial breaks during the episode. Suddenly, they gave Ellen the green light. They agreed to produce the coming out episode, which was secretly coded by the staff as the puppy episode. They did not do this because they had suddenly developed a moral compass. They did it because they saw a chance to exploit a woman's personal truth as a cheap, highly effective marketing trick to save their declining ratings. With the network demanding a script to cash in on the hype, a new massive problem emerged. The writers created the character of Susan. Susan was supposed to be the catalyst, the confident, openly gay television producer who helps Ellen realize her true identity. It was a crucial role. Ellen could not do the scene alone. She needed a partner on screen to make the emotional weight of the moment work. The producers started calling talent agencies. They offered the guest starring role to a long list of famous A-list Hollywood actresses. And one by one, almost every single actress said no. This is where The deep, quiet hypocrisy of the entertainment industry was exposed. Hollywood loved to project a liberal, accepting image to the public, but behind closed doors, it was ruthlessly conservative when it came to protecting a brand. The agents and managers of these famous actresses told their clients to stay far away from the show. They warned them that playing a lesbian on national television would permanently ruin their image. They said it would alienate traditional fans and cost them future movie roles. The industry looked at Ellen like she was standing on a sinking ship, and no one wanted to jump on board to help her. Ellen found herself completely isolated, realizing that her peers were too afraid of losing their own paychecks to stand next to her. Then, the script landed on the desk of Laura Dern. At the time, Laura Dern was a highly respected rising star in the industry. She had built a formidable reputation as a serious actress, earning an Academy Award nomination and anchoring massive global blockbusters. She had a pristine career trajectory and absolutely everything to lose. She did not need to take a guest starring role on a sitcom. But when Laura read the script and heard about the resistance from the rest of the industry, she made a different calculation. She did not look at the role of Susan as a career hazard. She looked at Ellen and saw a human being who was completely alone, facing down a corporate machine and a hostile public. Laura accepted the role. When Laura walked onto the studio lot, she was not just walking on as a hired actress. She was walking on as a human shield. The initial meetings between Ellen and Laura set the foundation for everything that would happen next. They had to sit down and discuss exactly what they were about to do. Ellen was terrified. She knew she was putting her entire livelihood on the line. If the public rejected the episode, the network would fire her immediately. Laura understood the stakes completely. She knew the unwritten rules of Hollywood. She knew that by agreeing to hold Ellen's hand on screen, the conservative power brokers in the industry would view her as guilty by association. But Laura made a conscious choice to absorb some of that incoming fire. She saw the intense vulnerability in Ellen and decided that supporting another woman through a historic, highly dangerous personal milestone was more important than pleasing studio executives. As the days counted down to the filming of the airport scene, the tension on the set was suffocating. Security had to be increased. The cast and crew were acutely aware that they were crossing a line that had never been crossed on network television. Ellen and Laura spent hours talking, building the trust required to make the scene work. They were two women standing shoulder to shoulder, preparing to face the barrel of public opinion. The network executives were busy calling advertisers, negotiating higher rates for the commercial slots, completely detached from the severe psychological pressure resting on the shoulders of the two women actually doing the work. The trap was fully set, the cameras were ready to roll, and the defining moment of their lives was about to begin. The day of the filming arrived, and the atmosphere inside the studio was thick with a very specific, heavy kind of terror. This was not a normal day on a sitcom set. Usually the soundstage was a place of light-hearted jokes, missed lines, and casual laughter. But as the crew prepared for the famous airport scene, a dead silence fell over the room. The executives from the network were watching closely from the shadows, their eyes firmly fixed on the monitors, waiting to see if their multi-million-dollar gamble was going to pay off. In the center of it all stood Ellen. The physical toll of the moment was entirely visible on her. She was about to look into a camera lens and destroy the protective wall she had spent her entire adult life building. She was not just playing a character who was coming out. She was a real woman standing in front of the world, offering up her deepest vulnerability. The anxiety was suffocating. If this went wrong, her career was instantly over. Standing directly across from her was Laura Dern. The dynamic between the two women in this exact moment is the key to why the scene became so iconic. Laura was not looking at Ellen as a co-star executing a script. She was looking at a friend who was about to jump off a cliff. When the director called action, Ellen delivered the line. She leaned into the airport microphone and announced, "I'm gay." If you watch that scene closely today, you do not see two actresses pretending to be in a romantic comedy. You see a raw, unfiltered human transaction. The look in Laura Dern's eyes is not a rehearsed reaction. It is pure, genuine empathy. Her warm smile and the softness in her expression were real-life mechanisms of psychological support. Laura was acting as a physical anchor in the room, silently telling Ellen that she was safe, that she was seen, and that she was not standing in the fire alone. The explosive chemistry that translated through the television screen was actually the deep, powerful bond of two women surviving a highly hostile environment together. When the studio audience erupted in screams and cheers, the emotion in the room was genuine. For that brief, shining moment, Ellen and Laura believed they had actually broken the system. They believed they had forced the Hollywood machine to accept them. On April 30th, 1997, the ABC network broadcast the episode to the public. The cultural impact was a massive, undeniable earthquake. 42 million people sat in their living rooms and watched the broadcast. The numbers were staggering. It was the television equivalent of a cultural moon landing. Behind the heavy wooden doors of the network boardrooms, the executives were not shedding tears of joy for human rights. They were looking at the viewership data and counting their cash. Because the anticipation for the episode was so massive, the network had charged absolutely astronomical prices for commercial airtime. They sold advertisements for cars, soft drinks, and fast food at premium rates, capitalizing on the intense public curiosity. In a single night, the network generated tens of millions of dollars in pure profit. For a few days, the corporate suits threw parties. They patted themselves on the back and gave interviews to the press, proudly framing themselves as brave pioneers of modern media. They gladly took the credit for the historic moment, happily eating the massive profits that were generated entirely by Ellen's personal pain and Laura's professional bravery. The executives treated the two women like heroes because for that 1 week, the women had made them incredibly rich. But the warm embrace of television capitalism is entirely conditional, and it evaporates the exact second the profit margin is threatened. The celebration did not even last a full month. Almost immediately, a massive, highly organized backlash began to form. Conservative groups, religious organizations, and angry viewers began flooding the network with complaints, demanding that the show be taken off the air. The switchboards lit up with hateful messages. Protests were organized, but the network executives did not care about the angry letters. They only started to panic when the phone calls came from their corporate sponsors. Major advertisers, terrified of being associated with the controversy, began pulling their money away from the show. Huge corporations like Chrysler and Wendy's officially announced they would no longer buy commercial time during the program. This is the exact moment the corporate trap snapped shut on Ellen and Laura. The network executives looked at their financial spreadsheets and saw the advertising revenue dropping. The very same men who had just toasted with champagne and praised the actresses for their historic performance suddenly went completely cold. When the backlash hit, Ellen and Laura desperately needed the network to stand up, defend the show, and protect the people who worked for them. Instead, the ABC executives turned their backs completely. They wiped their hands clean of the entire situation. They stopped giving interviews, defending the program. They stopped answering calls from the producers. The corporate shield was instantly dropped to the floor, leaving Ellen and Laura standing completely exposed to a massive, hateful cultural storm. The system showed its true face. The executives proved that they never had a moral compass. They only had a balance sheet. They were perfectly happy to sell the concept of equality when it brought in record-breaking cash. But the moment that equality became a financial liability, they abandoned the women who had built the magic. Ellen and Laura suddenly found themselves completely isolated. The network had taken the money and run, locking the doors behind them and leaving the two women outside to face the mob alone. When the autumn of 1997 arrived, it looked for a very brief moment like Ellen had survived the worst of the storm. The network had officially renewed her sitcom for a 5th season. Her character was now openly gay, and the writers were preparing to explore what her new life and dating experiences would look like. Ellen went back to the studio lot, walking through the gates with the cautious hope that the controversy was finally behind her. She believed that since she had made the network so much money the previous spring, they would finally let her just do her job and be a comedian. But she was completely wrong. The ABC network had not renewed the show because they supported her. They brought the show back because they needed time to execute a quiet, calculated corporate murder. They needed to kill the show without looking like the bad guys. The first brutal strike came before the premiere episode of the new season even began. Millions of viewers turned on their televisions, expecting to hear the familiar upbeat theme song. Instead, the screen went completely black. A cold, silent text graphic appeared on the screen. Parental advisory. This program contains adult content. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand the sheer cruelty of this action, you have to remember what a parental advisory label actually meant in the 1990s. That specific warning was strictly reserved for television programs that featured graphic violence, extreme profanity, or heavy drug use. It was a tool used to warn parents that their children were about to see something dangerous. The network took that exact same warning label and stamped it onto a mild, lighthearted comedy about a woman going on coffee dates. They did not do this by accident. This was a highly strategic move by the executives to appease the angry sponsors and conservative groups who were still threatening to boycott the network. The executives were basically sending a signal to the angry advertisers saying, "Look, we agree with you. We know this lifestyle is dangerous. We are putting a warning label on it." For Ellen, the psychological trauma of this moment was devastating. Imagine walking into your workplace every single day, trying to write jokes and make people laugh, knowing that the people paying your salary view your actual life as a toxic hazard. The network was telling the entire American public that Ellen's fundamental identity was a danger to children. They took the historic, beautiful moment she had built with Laura Dern just a few months earlier and painted it with a brush of shame and disgust. Ellen was completely trapped in a contract with men who despised what she represented, but who still owned the rights to her face and her name. This leads to the most manipulative part of the television industry's playbook. You might ask, if the network hated the show so much, why didn't they just cancel it immediately after the airport episode? The answer is entirely about public relations and corporate cowardice. If the executives canceled the show right after the historic coming out episode, they would have looked like absolute bigots. Progressive organizations would have protested outside their headquarters. The left-leaning press would have destroyed their reputation. The executives needed a cover story. They needed the show to fail naturally so they could blame the cancellation on the audience instead of their own prejudice. So, they built a slow execution chamber. They decided to starve the show to death. How do you starve a massive television show? You completely cut off its oxygen. The network instantly stopped paying for promotional advertisements. You no longer saw commercials for the show during other programs. There were no billboards. There were no magazine spreads. Then they moved the show's broadcasting time slot. They took it away from its prime, highly viewed spot and pushed it into the worst possible hours of the week, times when they knew most of their loyal audience would not be sitting in front of the television. They made the show practically invisible. But the starvation was not just about the schedule. It was also about creative suffocation. The network executives began sending down a relentless stream of strict oppressive rules to the writing staff. They micromanaged every single script. They sent notes demanding that the show not be too gay. If Ellen's character went on a date, the executives demanded that the women not hold hands for too long. They restricted what the characters could talk about. They wanted Ellen to be gay in name only, completely stripped of any real human affection or reality. The writers were paralyzed. Ellen was exhausted. You cannot produce good comedy when you have a corporate executive standing on your neck holding a stopwatch to see how long you look at another woman. The show lost its humor. It lost its rhythm. It began to suffocate exactly as the network had planned. On the outside, Laura Dern was watching this entire process unfold with a growing sense of dread. She saw the network slowly and systematically crushing her friend. Laura had stepped into the fire to protect Ellen, believing that human empathy would eventually win out over corporate greed. But as she watched the warning labels flash on the screen and saw the show being buried in the schedule, Laura realized the terrifying scope of what the industry was actually doing. The executives were not just managing a television show. They were making an example out of Ellen. They were demonstrating exactly what happens to anyone who disrupts the traditional money-making machine. And as Laura watched Ellen being pushed to the brink of a complete mental collapse, a dark, heavy silence began to fall over her own life. The phone calls from her own agents were becoming less frequent. The warmer reception she usually received at industry events was turning noticeably cold. Laura began to realize that the executives were not going to stop with Ellen. The machine was turning its gears toward anyone who had helped her. By the spring of 1998, the starvation tactics worked perfectly. Because the show was hidden in a terrible time slot and creatively ruined by executive interference, the ratings finally dropped to a terminal level. The executives got exactly what they wanted. They called a press conference, threw their hands in the air, and put on their best acting performance. They told the press, we supported Ellen, we gave her a 5th season, but the viewers just lost interest. The numbers are not there, so we have no choice but to cancel the program. It was the perfect corporate murder. They engineered the failure, starved the victim, and then blamed the audience for the death. The sitcom was officially canceled. The studio sets were dismantled and thrown into dumpsters. Ellen was fired and pushed out of the studio gates. The network washed its hands of the entire mess and moved on to their next profitable project. But for Ellen and Laura, the real nightmare, the brutal industry-wide punishment, was only just beginning. The morning after the ABC network officially canceled the sitcom, an eerie, heavy silence fell over the lives of both Ellen DeGeneres and Laura Dern. In the entertainment industry, you measure your worth by the noise around you. You want the phone ringing, scripts arriving at your door, and agents calling with new offers. But in the summer of 1998, for both of these women, the noise completely stopped. It was not a gradual slowdown. It was an instant, total freezing out. They had been thrown out of the Hollywood Club, and the heavy iron doors were locked firmly behind them. Let us look closely at what happened to Laura Dern first, because her punishment reveals the absolute cold-blooded cruelty of the studio system. Laura was not the star of the canceled show. She was a guest star. She had simply shown up for a few days of work to play a role and hold the hand of a friend. Prior to that episode, Laura was on a golden path. She had an Academy Award nomination. She was the female lead in Jurassic Park, one of the highest-grossing movies in the history of cinema. She was exactly the type of actress that casting directors usually fought over. But suddenly, Laura could not get a job. Her management team would send out inquiries, and the doors would slam shut. Directors who used to beg her to be in their movies suddenly stopped returning her calls. For a full year and a half, Laura Dern did not work. She was placed on an unwritten, silent Hollywood blacklist. To understand why this happened, you have to understand how the men who run the entertainment industry think. The executives were furious with Ellen for forcing them to deal with a controversial reality, but they were specifically enraged at Laura Dern. Why? Because Laura gave Ellen legitimacy. By stepping onto that set, an A-list respected movie star validated Ellen's message. The studio bosses realized that if they let Laura get away with this, other powerful actors might start using their fame to support social causes that the networks deemed risky. The executives needed to maintain total control over their stars. They could not have actors prioritizing human empathy over corporate profit. So, they decided to make a brutal, highly visible example out of Laura. They starved her career to send a terrifying warning to every other straight actor in Hollywood. If you step out of line, if you use your platform to help a disruptor, we will strip you of your livelihood. We do not care how famous you are. We do not care if you have been in the biggest movie in the world. We will erase you. For Laura, the psychological shock was deep and confusing. She had taken the role because she believed it was the morally right thing to do. She wanted to support a fellow woman who was taking a brave, terrifying step. And for doing the right thing, her career was effectively executed. She found herself sitting at home, wondering if she would ever be allowed to act again. The financial panic began to set in, but the emotional betrayal was far worse. She realized that the industry she had loved since she was a child did not care about her talent. It only cared about her obedience. Meanwhile, Ellen was trapped in her own private nightmare, and her pain was multiplied by a crushing sense of guilt. Ellen had lost her show, her income, and her public standing, but the hardest burden she had to carry was watching what was happening to Laura. Ellen knew exactly why Laura's phone had stopped ringing. She knew that her own personal truth, her decision to stop living a lie and announce that she was gay, was the direct cause of her friend's career being destroyed. Imagine the immense trauma of that realization. Ellen was already dealing with the rejection of the public and the betrayal of her network, but now she had to live with the knowledge that she had dragged an innocent ally down into the darkness with her. This guilt ate away at Ellen. She felt like a toxic force. She isolated herself, retreating entirely from the public eye because she felt that anyone who stood next to her would be punished by the Hollywood machine. The industry did not just take away their jobs, they also unleashed the media to destroy their reputations. This is the final, most manipulative weapon the corporate system uses. The network executives could not just fire Ellen and blacklist Laura. They had to make sure the public blamed the women for their own downfall. Throughout the late 1990s, entertainment reporters and tabloid journalists began writing scathing articles about Ellen. They did not investigate how the network sabotaged the show. They did not write about the cowardly advertisers who pulled their funding. Instead, they wrote that Ellen had pushed her agenda too hard. They claimed she was too militant and that she forgot how to be funny. They painted her as a bitter, angry woman who ruined her own successful television show because she could not stop talking about her personal life. The media gaslighted the entire country. They protected the wealthy conservative executives by shifting all the blame onto the victim. They made the audience believe that Ellen was the problem, completely hiding the fact that the network had strangled the show on purpose. And when the media mentioned Laura Dern, they framed her decision to play the role as a terrible career move, treating her moral courage like a foolish business mistake. This coordinated attack broke Ellen down. She fell into a severe, crippling depression. She was a comedian whose entire life was built on making people smile. And suddenly, she was the punchline of every cruel joke in the country. She could not get a meeting with a television producer. She could not book a stand-up comedy tour because promoters were too afraid of protests. She was completely financially cut off and emotionally drained. For months, Ellen and Laura existed in this heavy, dark exile. They were two women who had experienced the absolute highest peaks of Hollywood success, now pushed entirely to the outside, treated like diseases that the industry needed to quarantine. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to. It extracted tens of millions of dollars from their historic television moment, safely deposited that money into corporate bank accounts, and then ruthlessly crushed the human beings who had generated it. The executives had proven that the house always wins, and anyone who tries to change the rules of the house will be buried alive. The calendar turned to 1999, and the bright, flashing lights of the controversy finally faded. The news cameras packed up and left. The tabloid journalists found new targets to attack. The angry protesters moved on to their next outrage. But for Ellen DeGeneres and Laura Dern, the quiet that followed the storm was far worse than the screaming. They were left completely alone in the silent, suffocating reality of their exile. To understand the specific heavy trauma they endured during these years, you have to look closely at what it means to be erased by the industry you gave your life to. This was not a temporary vacation. This was a complete systematic removal from society. For Ellen, the psychological collapse was absolute. You have to remember the psychology of a comedian. A comedian builds their entire identity on the immediate validation of an audience. They need the laughter of a room to feel accepted and safe. Ellen had spent her whole life using her humor to make people happy, using jokes as a shield to protect her deeply guarded secrets. Now, that shield was gone. The audience was gone. The laughter was replaced by a cold, heavy disgust from the very public she had entertained for years. Ellen found herself trapped inside her own house. The phone never rang. Her bank accounts, once filled with massive network paychecks, began to slowly drain. She was completely isolated. But the most damaging part of her trauma was the crushing, suffocating guilt she felt every time she thought about Laura. Ellen knew exactly how the Hollywood machine operated. She looked at Laura, a brilliant, highly respected actress who had been on the fast track to becoming one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and saw a woman whose career was completely frozen. Ellen internalized all of this blame. She began to view herself as a toxic hazard. In her mind, her personal truth, her decision to announce she was gay, was a deadly virus that had infected and destroyed her friend's livelihood. This guilt created a painful, difficult dynamic between the two women. When they spoke, Ellen was constantly apologizing. She felt she had dragged an innocent woman into a slaughterhouse. Ellen felt that if she reached out to Laura, or if they were seen together, she would only bring Laura more bad luck and anger from the studio bosses. The system had successfully made Ellen hate herself. The network executives wanted Ellen to feel entirely responsible for the destruction, and the tactic worked perfectly. She was broken, drowning in regret, and terrified that she had ruined Laura's life forever. But Laura Dern's reaction to this trauma reveals a deep, powerful strength, though it came with its own severe psychological cost. Laura was Hollywood royalty. She was born into the industry. She knew the unwritten rules better than anyone. When her agent stopped calling and the scripts stopped arriving at her door, the reality of the blacklist hit her like a physical blow. Laura was facing a terrifying identity crisis. If she was not allowed to act, who was she? She had trained her whole life to perform, and now the heavy iron doors of the studios were locked against her. The executives wanted to break her spirit. They wanted her to panic. The unspoken rule of the blacklist was that if Laura publicly apologized, if she distanced herself from Ellen, and if she promised to never step out of line again, they might eventually let her come back to work. They wanted her to beg. She absolutely refused to beg. When Ellen came to her, heavy with guilt and endlessly apologizing for destroying her career, Laura had to stand firm. Laura refused to let Ellen take the blame. She looked at Ellen and directed the anger exactly where it belonged, at the cowardly, greedy men in the corporate boardrooms. Laura understood the system. She knew that Ellen was not the enemy. The enemy was a corporate structure that punished human empathy. However, holding that strong, supportive line for Ellen took an immense emotional toll on Laura. Behind closed doors, away from Ellen, Laura was genuinely terrified. She was watching her prime earning years vanish. She was watching other actresses take the roles that should have been hers. She was holding Ellen up, providing psychological support to a friend who was entirely broken, while secretly carrying the heavy fear that she might never stand in front of a camera again. The dynamic between them was bonded by trauma. They were two soldiers left behind in enemy territory, relying on each other to survive, but deeply scarred by the fact that they were both bleeding. This is exactly how the television and film industry maintains its power. The system is designed to be ruthless. The network executives do not just want to fire you. They want to erase you completely. They want the public to forget you ever existed. Look at what the ABC network did. While Ellen and Laura were sitting at home in the dark, they smoothly replaced Ellen's time slot with another safe, traditional, completely harmless sitcom. The executives went back to their country clubs and their board meetings. They continued to collect their massive bonuses. They wanted the culture to reset to the factory settings of the early 1990s. They actively rewrote history by omission, acting as if the historic puppy episode was just a strange, unfortunate mistake that had been successfully corrected. The executives rely on the short memory of the public. They know that if they keep you off the television screen for a year or two, The audience will eventually stop asking where you went. They wanted to starve Ellen and Laura into total submission. They wanted them to become cautionary tales, ghost stories whispered by casting directors to keep young, new actors in line. For nearly 2 years, this cruel, silent execution worked flawlessly. The system had beaten them down to the absolute bottom. Ellen was deeply depressed, financially terrified, and convinced she was a toxic failure. Laura was locked out of her profession, watching her hard-earned status evaporate. The Hollywood machine had chewed them up, extracted the profit, and spat them out into the cold. But the executives underestimated a fundamental truth about human survival. When you take absolutely everything away from someone, when you strip them of their job, their reputation, and their fear of losing, you accidentally set them free. The system had pushed Ellen and Laura so far into the dark that they had nothing left to protect. And when a person has nothing left to lose, the rules of the corporate machine no longer apply to them. The long, brutal winter of their blacklist was slowly coming to an end, and the slow, difficult fight back to the surface was about to begin. The year 2000 arrived, and the landscape of the entertainment industry was slowly beginning to change. But for Ellen DeGeneres and Laura Dern, the heavy iron doors of the major Hollywood studios were still locked tight. The executives who had thrown them out were hoping that the long, cold silence of the blacklist would eventually force them to quit the business entirely. They wanted Ellen to disappear into early retirement, and they wanted Laura to fade into obscurity. But the executives fundamentally misunderstood human psychology. When you hold the threat of a blacklist over an actor's head, you have immense power because the actor is terrified of losing their career. But once you actually pull the trigger, once you take away their show, their money, and their status, you lose all of your leverage. Ellen and Laura had already survived the absolute worst punishment the television and film industry could deliver. They had hit rock bottom. And the strange, powerful thing about hitting rock bottom is that you no longer have any fear of falling. Laura Dern was the first to realize that the rules of the game had to change. She looked at the Hollywood landscape and understood a hard, cold truth. The massive corporate studios, the places that made the giant blockbuster movies and the network television shows, were never going to invite her back through the front door. The men in charge of those corporations were too cowardly. They were still terrified of angry advertisers and conservative backlash. If Laura sat by the phone waiting for a network executive to apologize and offer her a job, she would be waiting for the rest of her life. So Laura made a highly strategic, incredibly difficult decision. She turned her back on the major studio system completely. She decided to bypass the corporate gatekeepers and take her talent to the only place that still valued pure acting over safe public relations, the independent film circuit. To understand why this was such a brutal transition, you have to look at the financial reality. When an actress of Laura's level works on a major studio movie like Jurassic Park, she is paid millions of dollars. She is provided with massive trailers, luxury travel, and a huge support staff. Independent films offer absolutely none of that. Independent movies are not funded by giant corporations that sell fast food or cars. They are funded by private investors who scrape together small budgets. The pay is terrible. The hours are exhausting. The working conditions are rough. But independent filmmakers do not care about network sponsors. They do not care about conservative boycotts or warning labels. They only care about raw, human talent. Laura Dern walked away from the glamour and stepped into the gritty, unpolished world of independent cinema. She accepted roles in small, low-budget films that the major studios would never touch. She took massive pay cuts, sometimes working for scale, which is the absolute minimum wage an actor can be paid under union rules. She was a Hollywood royalty figure who was suddenly working in the dirt, but this was a calculated strike. Every time Laura delivered a brilliant, emotionally devastating performance in a small independent movie, she embarrassed the major studio bosses. When independent film critics wrote glowing reviews of her acting, it served as a loud, undeniable reminder to the entire industry that Laura Dern was still here. She proved that their blacklist was based entirely on corporate fear, not on a lack of ability. She refused to let the executives erase her. She built a new foundation brick by brick, entirely outside of their control. While Laura was fighting her war in the independent film trenches, Ellen DeGeneres was watching her closely. This dynamic between the two women during this period was crucial to their survival. For the first 2 years of their exile, Ellen had been drowning in a suffocating pool of guilt. She felt like a toxic virus. She blamed herself every time Laura lost a major movie role, but watching Laura aggressively fight back began to change Ellen's mindset. Seeing Laura refuse to surrender, seeing her take tough, low-paying jobs just to keep practicing her craft, was the exact psychological medicine Ellen needed. Ellen realized that apologizing and hiding in her house was exactly what the network executives wanted her to do. They wanted her to feel ashamed. Laura's relentless work ethic showed Ellen that life actually existed outside the corporate television machine. If Laura could rebuild a career without the approval of the studio bosses, then Ellen could do it too. Ellen's crushing guilt slowly began to transform into a quiet, focused anger. Ellen looked at her own situation. She had no television network. No major production company would give her a sitcom. But Ellen remembered who she was before the network executives got their hands on her. She was a stand-up comedian. Stand-up comedy is the most raw, stripped-down form of entertainment in the world. It is the only format where you do not need a middleman. To do a stand-up comedy tour, you do not need a network executive to approve your script. You do not need a corporate sponsor to buy commercial time. You do not need a censor to tell you what words you can and cannot say. You only need a microphone, an empty stage, and an audience willing to buy a ticket. Ellen decided to bypass the television machine the exact same way Laura had bypassed the movie studios. She went back to the stage. This was an incredibly terrifying step for Ellen. For years, she had hidden behind the character on her sitcom. Now she had to walk out onto a stage under a bright spotlight, completely exposed. She knew that every single person sitting in those theater seats knew all of her secrets. They knew about the cancellation. They knew about the controversy. They knew she had been thrown out of Hollywood. But when Ellen grabbed the microphone, she did something brilliant. She did not try to pretend that the last 3 years had not happened. She addressed the elephant in the room. She talked about the pain of losing her show. She talked about the absurdity of the television executives. She stripped away the sanitized, squeaky clean polish of the network sitcom and showed the audience her actual human scars. The reaction from the live audience was exactly what the corporate executives had feared the most. The people in those theaters did not walk out. They did not protest. They laughed. They connected with her. They saw a human being who had been beaten down by a massive corporate system, and they cheered for her resilience. By taking their careers directly to the people, Laura through independent film and Ellen through live stand-up comedy, they cut the cowardly executives completely out of the equation. They removed the power from the boardroom and placed it directly into the hands of the audience. This shared struggle forged a bond between Ellen and Laura that was completely unbreakable. They were no longer two women apologizing to each other for a career disaster. They were veterans of the exact same war. They became each other's lifelines. When Ellen was terrified before a live show, she thought of Laura pushing through grueling independent film shoots. When Laura felt the sting of a major studio rejecting her, she looked at Ellen standing bravely on a stage in front of thousands of people. They checked in on each other. They reminded each other that their talent was real and that the system that threw them away was entirely broken. Back in the heavily guarded offices of the television networks, the executives were beginning to realize they had a massive problem. The calendar was moving forward. The culture of the country was slowly beginning to shift. The intense conservative grip of the late 1990s television landscape was starting to loosen as a new generation of viewers grew up. The internet was expanding, giving people access to different voices and different perspectives. The executives who had proudly canceled Ellen's show and blacklisted Laura Dern were starting to look foolish. Their decision, which they had originally praised as a brilliant business move to protect their advertising revenue, was slowly aging into a massive corporate embarrassment. The public was starting to realize that the network had acted with extreme cruelty. Ellen's stand-up comedy tours were selling out theaters across the country. Laura's independent performances were gaining momentum and earning deep respect from real filmmakers. The television bosses watched this happening and realized they could no longer control the narrative. They had tried to bury two women alive, but they had forgotten that seeds grow in the dark. Ellen and Laura were breaking through the concrete, and the Hollywood machine was completely powerless to stop them. The slow, grueling climb out of the dirt was working, and the industry was about to be forced to reckon with the women they had tried to destroy. As the calendar pushed into the early 2000s, a strange and deeply hypocritical shift began to occur within the Hollywood machinery. The culture of the country was changing. The internet was giving regular people a voice, and the rigid conservative grip that the television networks held over the American public was starting to loosen. The television executives who lived entirely by the numbers on their spreadsheets realized that their audience was moving forward. And just like that, the men who had proudly thrown Ellen DeGeneres and Laura Dern out into the cold suddenly realized there was new money to be made off the very women they had banished. This is the most twisted psychological phase of corporate abuse. The entertainment industry is not built to apologize. When the studio bosses realize they made a mistake that cost them money, they do not issue a public statement of regret. They do not call you to say they are sorry for starving you, ruining your reputation, and putting you through years of intense mental torture. Instead, they simply pick up the phone, offer you a job, and expect you to smile and pretend the abuse never happened. For both Ellen and Laura, the return of these phone calls did not feel like a victory. It felt like a trap. Laura was the first to experience this sickening whiplash. Because she had spent the last few years working relentlessly in small, gritty, independent films, she had earned massive critical respect. She had proven she was a powerhouse of acting talent. Suddenly, the major corporate studios, the exact same studios that had blacklisted her and refused to let her pass the security gates, wanted to hire her again. They needed her prestige to make their commercial movies look good. Laura found herself sitting in the plush, expensive offices of the very executives who had tried to erase her. They gave her the classic fake Hollywood hugs. They smiled brightly and told her how much they had missed her. For Laura, the psychological trauma of sitting in those rooms was incredibly heavy. She looked across the desk at these men and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were lying to her face. She knew they did not care about her talent or her humanity. They only cared that she was currently popular with the critics, and they wanted to attach her name to their product to make a profit. Laura had to make a brutally difficult choice. She could hold on to her rightful anger, refuse to work for the people who had hurt her, and stay in the low-paying independent film world forever. Or she could swallow her pride, take the massive studio paychecks, and secure her financial future. It was an agonizing dilemma. She was being asked to shake hands with her abusers. At the exact same time, Ellen was facing her own corporate nightmare. Because her live stand-up comedy tours were selling out massive theaters, the television networks noticed that she still had a huge, highly profitable fan base. A television production company approached Ellen with an idea. They did not want to give her another sitcom. Instead, they wanted to give her a daytime talk show. When Ellen heard the pitch, her immediate reaction was pure, paralyzing panic. The idea of returning to a major television network triggered deep, severe trauma. She vividly remembered the pain of 1997. She remembered the network executives micromanaging her life, placing warning labels on her face, and blaming her for the failure of a show they had intentionally sabotaged. She remembered the crushing depression of being locked inside her house, terrified that the world hated her. The thought of signing another contract, of giving another group of wealthy executives control over her career, made her physically sick. She was terrified they would just use her again, wait for the ratings to drop, and throw her back into the dumpster. In this moment of intense crisis, Ellen and Laura leaned on each other heavily. The bond they had forged in the dark years of the blacklist became their primary survival tool. They spent hours on the phone talking through the bitter reality of the industry. They were two women trying to figure out how to walk back into the lion's den without getting eaten alive a second time. During these conversations, Laura provided the hard, practical perspective that Ellen desperately needed. Laura told Ellen that staying away out of fear was exactly what the executives wanted. The executives wanted the power to keep them in the shadows. Laura made Ellen realize that the only way to truly defeat the corporate machine was to take their money, use their massive platforms, and build an empire right in front of their faces. But Laura made one thing absolutely clear. If they were going back, they could never be naive again. They could never trust the executives. They had to treat the industry exactly how the industry treated them, as a cold, calculated business transaction. This shared realization was a profound turning point for both of them. Their relationship shifted from shared suffering to shared strategy. They were no longer victims holding each other up. They were veterans putting their armor back on. When Ellen finally agreed to do the daytime talk show, which launched in 2003, she did it with a completely new mindset. She walked onto the studio lot not as an eager comedian hoping for approval, but as a hardened survivor who knew exactly how dangerous the building was. She demanded a level of creative control she never had during her sitcom years. She played the game perfectly. She danced with her guests, she kept the tone light, and she made Middle America comfortable. But beneath the dancing and the jokes, Ellen was operating with a ruthless focus. She was building a massive financial and cultural fortress around herself, ensuring that no network executive would ever have the power to erase her again. She used the network's money to make herself untouchable. Laura took the exact same approach in the film world. She accepted the roles in the big studio movies, and she cashed the massive checks, but she never gave her soul back to the Hollywood machine. She kept one foot firmly in the independent film world, working with directors she actually trusted. She treated the major studios purely as a bank. She walked red carpets and smiled for the cameras. But the naive actress who had once believed Hollywood was a family was gone forever. In her place was a brilliant, strategic woman who understood that her talent was a weapon, and she alone controlled how it was used. Their shared trauma protected them from the toxic illusion of fame. Because Ellen and Laura had survived the absolute worst the industry could do to them, they were completely immune to the fake flattery of the executives. When a studio boss praised Laura, she knew it was empty. When a network president congratulated Ellen on her high daytime ratings, she knew he would fire her the second those ratings dropped. They shared this dark secret knowledge. It kept them grounded. It kept them safe. As Ellen's talk show quickly became the biggest hit on daytime television, and as Laura's career surged back to the top of the A-list, a bitter irony settled over the entertainment industry. The very same corporations that had proudly thrown these two women into the trash in 1998 were now paying them millions of dollars to save their profit margins in 2003. The executives patted themselves on the back for hiring them, completely ignoring the fact that they were the ones who had destroyed them in the first place. Ellen and Laura watched this corporate hypocrisy play out in real time. They did not demand public apologies because they knew they would never get them. They did not scream at the executives because anger is a waste of energy in Hollywood. Instead, they took the ultimate quiet revenge. They forced the men who had tried to ruin them to write their paychecks. They proved that the corporate system, with all its money, its warning labels, and its blacklists, was ultimately weaker than the raw human resilience of two women who simply refused to stay in the dark. As the late 2000s rolled in, Ellen DeGeneres and Laura Dern had successfully pulled themselves out of the Hollywood graveyard. They had done the impossible. They had beaten a corporate blacklist. Ellen's daytime talk show was generating billions of dollars in advertising revenue, and Laura was firmly reestablished as one of the most respected, highly sought-after actresses in the film industry. On the surface, it looked like a perfect, happy Hollywood ending. The magazines called it a great comeback story. The television networks patted themselves on the back for being so welcoming and progressive. But behind the bright studio lights and the expensive red carpets, the reality was much heavier and far more complicated. Surviving a corporate assassination changes you permanently. You do not just go back to being the person you were before the trauma. Ellen and Laura were now sitting at the absolute top of the entertainment industry, but they were navigating this new power with the cold, hardened minds of war veterans. To understand their mindset during this era, you have to look closely at the root cause of why the industry let them back in. For older audiences who have watched the world change over the decades, you know that massive corporations do not suddenly develop a moral conscience. The ABC network executives from 1997 did not wake up one morning and realize they had been cruel. What actually happened was a massive shift in technology and culture. The internet broke the total monopoly of the television networks. In the past, a few wealthy men in suits could control exactly what the American public saw. If they wanted to erase you, they just took you off the screen and you ceased to exist. But by the late 2000s, people were getting their entertainment from multiple sources online. The culture was moving rapidly, becoming more accepting and open-minded. The old corporate executives looked at their dropping ratings and realized their old conservative business model was dying. They had to adapt or lose their jobs. They did not hire Ellen and Laura back because they were sorry. They hired them back because the public demanded it and the executives needed the cash. Ellen and Laura understood this brutal mechanic perfectly. This shared understanding formed the core of their private conversations. They knew that the smiles from the studio bosses were completely fake. They knew that the exact same executives who were now sending them expensive gift baskets and inviting them to luxury dinners would gladly throw them back into the dirt if the ratings ever dropped again. This created a very specific, heavy psychological burden, especially for Ellen. Ellen had built a massive daytime empire, but to keep that empire running, she had to play a very specific role every single day. She had to be the nice, happy, dancing lady. The network demanded it. The advertisers demanded it. The audience wanted to turn on their televisions at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and feel good. But imagine the intense mental exhaustion of having to dance and smile every single day for the very same industry that had completely destroyed your life just a decade earlier. Ellen was sitting across from celebrity guests who had stayed completely silent when she was blacklisted. She was shaking hands with producers who had refused to return her phone calls in 1998. She had to pretend that everything was fine, that the industry was a big, happy family, while carrying the deep, unhealed trauma of her past. This is where Laura Dern's presence in her life became absolutely critical. Laura was the grounding wire. When Ellen felt the crushing weight of the Hollywood hypocrisy, when the fake smiles of the executives became too much to handle, she turned to Laura. Laura understood the bizarre, toxic reality of Hollywood's fake nice culture better than anyone on earth. Laura had grown up in the business. She knew how to separate the corporate lies from human reality. When Ellen would call Laura, exhausted from performing the happy daytime persona, Laura would give her the cold, practical advice she needed to hear. Laura reminded Ellen that the dancing and the jokes were just a job. It was armor. Laura told her, take their money, deposit the checks, but never let them convince you that they are your friends. You own the house now. You make the rules. While Ellen was conquering daytime television, Laura was using her own trauma to completely reshape her acting career. Before the blacklist, the studios often tried to put Laura in safe traditional roles. They wanted her to be the quiet girlfriend or the supportive wife. But after surviving the corporate punishment, Laura refused to play safe characters ever again. She deliberately chose to play women who were complex, messy, angry, and deeply flawed. She took her real-life anger against the controlling Hollywood system and poured it directly into her characters. Ellen watched Laura do this and drew massive strength from it. Seeing Laura refuse to be sanitized by the studio system gave Ellen the courage to keep pushing boundaries on her own show. They were operating in two totally different spheres of the industry. Ellen in daytime television, Laura in prestige film, but they were running the exact same strategy. They were using the system's money to build their own independent power. By the 2010s, a fascinating and deeply satisfying shift in the power dynamic finally occurred. Ellen DeGeneres had become so incredibly powerful in the daytime television space that she literally controlled the box office. If a major movie studio wanted their new film to be a massive hit, they absolutely needed their lead actors to sit on Ellen's couch. A 5-minute interview on Ellen's show could guarantee millions of dollars in ticket sales. Think about the incredible irony of this situation. The wealthy, powerful studio executives, the exact type of men who had blacklisted Laura Dern in 1997 to protect their movie profits, were now forced to beg Ellen DeGeneres for airtime to save their current movies. Ellen knew exactly how much power she held, and she used it to protect her people. When Laura had a new independent film coming out, a film with a tiny budget and no money for advertising, Ellen would bring Laura onto the show. Ellen would use her massive billion-dollar corporate platform to promote Laura's work to the entire world. When Laura walked onto Ellen's talk show set, the audience cheered because they saw two famous friends reuniting. But the audience did not know the deep, unspoken history playing out right in front of them. When Ellen and Laura sat in those comfortable chairs, smiling at the cameras, they were sharing a private, victorious joke. They remembered sitting in empty houses in 1998, terrified that they would never work again. They remembered the media calling them toxic. They remembered the executives telling them they were worthless. And now, here they were. Ellen owned the most valuable real estate in television, and Laura was an untouchable, critically acclaimed movie star. They had not just survived the Hollywood machine, they had completely hijacked it. But standing at the very top of the mountain comes with a new dangerous set of problems. When you become the boss, when you build a massive corporate empire, you become a target. Ellen was no longer just a comedian. She was the head of a massive brand that employed hundreds of people. The pressure to keep the machine running perfectly was immense. The larger Ellen's empire grew, the more isolated she became from normal everyday reality. When you have that much money and power, you are constantly surrounded by sycophants. You are surrounded by people who are paid to agree with you, people who laugh at all your jokes because they want to keep their jobs. It is incredibly easy to lose your grip on reality when no one is allowed to tell you the truth. This is why their friendship was the most valuable asset either of them possessed. Laura was not on Ellen's payroll. Laura did not need Ellen's money, and she did not need Ellen to boost her career. Because of the trauma they had survived together, Laura was one of the only people on earth who could look Ellen in the eye and tell her the absolute uncomfortable truth. When the stress of managing the empire made Ellen lose her perspective, Laura was there to pull her back down to earth. Laura constantly reminded Ellen to separate the massive corporate Ellen brand from the actual human woman inside. They had fought so hard to beat the system, but now they had to fight equally hard to ensure they did not become the cold corporate monsters they had spent their entire lives running away from. The final test of their survival was not about getting their careers back. It was about seeing if they could hold on to their humanity while sitting on the throne of a deeply corrupt industry. As the 2010s came to a close, Ellen DeGeneres and Laura Dern were entirely different women from the terrified outcasts they had been in the late 1990s. They had survived the worst the industry could throw at them and emerged victorious. Laura was winning massive awards, including an Oscar, completely dominating both television and film on her own terms. Ellen was the undisputed queen of daytime television. She had built a massive billion-dollar corporate empire built around a very specific, carefully crafted slogan, "Be kind." But the entertainment industry is a highly predatory ecosystem. It does not allow anyone to sit peacefully at the top forever. The system loves to build a hero because a hero generates ratings. But the system knows a dark, ugly secret about human nature. The public loves watching a hero get destroyed even more. A downfall generates massive internet traffic, endless news cycles, and millions of dollars in advertising clicks. And for Ellen, The exact same corporate machine that had destroyed her in 1997 was quietly preparing to do it all over again. To understand why this happened, you have to look at the trap of the Be Kind brand. Running a daily television show is not a friendly, relaxed process. It is a ruthless, high-pressure, exhausting factory. It requires managing hundreds of employees, dealing with massive budgets, and making hard, unpopular decisions every single day. But Ellen was not allowed to be a tough boss because the network had sold her to the public as the nicest woman in the world. Any normal human frustration, any bad day, or any strict workplace rule was viewed as a massive, hypocritical betrayal. The network had placed her on an impossibly high pedestal, completely ignoring the fact that it is impossible to run a corporate empire using only hugs and dancing. In the summer of 2020, the trap snapped shut. A series of articles were published detailing a toxic work environment behind the scenes of Ellen's talk show. Former employees came forward claiming they faced intimidation, fear, and unfair treatment from the senior producers. What followed was one of the most aggressive rapid media executions in modern television history. The internet went into an absolute frenzy. The same entertainment reporters who had praised Ellen for years suddenly turned into a firing squad. They published daily articles tearing apart her character. Social media campaigns were organized to have her show canceled. Every celebrity guest who had ever had an awkward interview with her suddenly spoke to the press, eagerly adding fuel to the fire. If you look closely at the mechanics of this scandal, you will see the exact same corporate cowardice that destroyed Ellen in 1997. Who was actually running the daily operations of the talk show? It was a group of high-level executive producers and corporate managers employed by Warner Brothers Television. These were the men actually in charge of human resources, firing, and daily workplace culture. But when the scandal hit, where were these executives? They were completely invisible. Just like the ABC network bosses had done 23 years earlier, the corporate executives hid in the shadows and let Ellen take all the bullets. They did not issue public statements taking responsibility for the workplace culture they had overseen and profited from. Instead, they launched an internal investigation, fired a few producers to look like they were taking action, and pushed Ellen out in front of the cameras to apologize and take the full brunt of the public's hatred. They used her face as a shield to protect their corporate reputation. For Ellen, the psychological impact of the 2020 scandal was a terrifying, violent case of PTSD. She woke up one morning and found herself right back in 1998. Once again, the media was calling her toxic. Once again, the public was demanding she be taken off the air. And most painfully, once again, her friends in Hollywood were quietly backing away from her. In the entertainment industry, friendships are usually just business alliances. When a star becomes controversial, their Hollywood friends stop returning their texts because they are afraid the bad press will ruin their own image. During the summer of 2020, Ellen watched her phone go completely silent. Dozens of A-list actors and musicians, people who had eagerly sat on her couch to promote their movies and albums just weeks prior, completely abandoned her. They deleted photos with her from their social media accounts. They ran away to protect their own paychecks, but one phone call did not stop. Laura Dern did not back away. While the rest of Hollywood panicked and ran for the exits, Laura stood absolutely firm. This is where the profound difference between a Hollywood friendship and a bond forged in real trauma becomes clear. Laura did not care about the internet backlash. She did not care about bad press. Laura had been blacklisted. She knew what it felt like to be erased by the industry. She had stood next to Ellen in the fire in 1997, and she was not going to abandon her now. Laura became Ellen's primary emotional anchor during this second downfall. When Ellen was drowning in depression, entirely convinced that the entire world hated her, Laura was the one who drove over to her house. Laura sat with her, away from the cameras, away from the producers, and provided the hard, grounding reality that Ellen desperately needed. Laura reminded Ellen of exactly how the Hollywood machine works. She explained to Ellen that the media did not actually care about workplace safety. If the media cared about toxic workplaces, they would investigate the corporate executives who actually ran the studios. Laura told Ellen that the media was simply destroying her because tearing down a powerful woman was highly profitable. Laura refused to let Ellen take the full blame for a corporate system that was inherently broken. This level of support was incredibly crucial because Ellen was dangerously close to breaking completely. The pain of being rejected by the public a second time was almost too much to bear, but Laura reminded her of their shared history. Laura looked at Ellen and essentially said, "We survived the executives in 1997 when we had no money and no power. We are not going to let a new group of executives and internet tabloids destroy us now." This private support gave Ellen the clarity she needed to make the hardest decision of her professional life. The network wanted Ellen to stay on the air. Despite the scandal, the show was still making them money, and they wanted her to keep apologizing, keep taking the blame, and keep dancing for the audience. The executives wanted to bleed the brand dry until the very last drop of profit was gone. But Ellen, guided by the cold, practical advice of the only friend she truly trusted, decided to stop the machine herself. She realized that she could never win against a system that was designed to exploit her. If she stayed, she would be a hostage to the network and the media forever, constantly apologizing to protect the corporate bottom line. She decided to pull the plug. She announced that the upcoming season of her talk show would be her absolute last. She was not going to let the network cancel her, and she was not going to let the tabloids fire her. She was going to walk away on her own terms, completely shutting down the billion-dollar factory that had turned into a prison. As the final episodes of the daytime talk show approached, a profound sense of closure began to settle over both women. They had fought a war against the television industry that had lasted for over 2 decades. They had been used as bait. They had been blacklisted. They had fought their way back to the top, and they had seen the absolute ugliest sides of corporate greed. The illusion of Hollywood was completely shattered, leaving behind a cold, hard, but ultimately liberating truth about what truly matters when the cameras finally stop rolling. When the final episode of the Ellen DeGeneres show taped in the spring of 2022, the atmosphere on the studio lot was completely different from the panicked, terrified silence of the 1998 cancellation. The network executives were standing quietly on the sidelines, watching a massive source of their annual revenue pack up its boxes. They desperately wanted to milk the finale for ratings, selling the commercial airtime for premium prices one last time. But this time, they were absolutely powerless. They were not in control of the execution. Ellen was driving the car, and she was deliberately steering it straight out of the corporate gates. Walking away from a television show after 19 years is not just a career change. For Ellen, it was a massive psychological prison break. For nearly 2 decades, she had been held hostage by a brand. The network executives had sold the American public an image of a woman who never got angry, never got tired, and never stopped dancing. It was an impossible, suffocating biological standard. By pulling the plug on her own show, Ellen was finally giving herself permission to be a flawed, normal human being. She fired the corporate bosses before they could ever fire her. She took away their power to cancel her, permanently removing the weapon they had held over her head since she was a young comedian. While Ellen was shutting down the daytime factory, Laura Dern was standing at the absolute peak of the Hollywood mountain. Just a short time prior, she had won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. When Laura walked up to the stage to accept her Oscar, the entire industry stood up and applauded her. But if you look closely at the bitter reality of that applause, the deep hypocrisy of Hollywood is completely exposed. The very same studio bosses clapping for her in the front row, the men wearing expensive tuxedos and cheering her name, were the exact same type of men who had blacklisted her in 1997. They had tried to starve her out of the business to protect their conservative sponsors, and now, because she had beaten them, they were forced to hand her a gold statue. Laura did not win that award by playing the safe, quiet roles the executives had originally wanted her to play. She won it by taking on fierce, complicated, and entirely uncompromising characters. She had beaten the system by completely refusing to play by its rules. The parallel journeys of these two women expose the absolute fraud of the entertainment industry. The system is fundamentally designed to isolate people. The executives want actors to be insecure, competitive, and constantly afraid. If you are terrified of losing your job, you will do whatever the network tells you to do. You will accept the warning labels. You will accept the bad time slots. You will apologize when you have done nothing wrong. But Ellen and Laura defeated that system because they completely refused to be isolated. The trauma they shared in 1997 acted as a permanent, unbreakable shield against Hollywood manipulation. When the industry tried to tear Ellen down for a second time in 2020, they fully expected her to crumble. They expected her Hollywood friends to run away, which most of the industry did, but the network executives did not account for Laura Dern. They did not account for a friendship that was forged in a corporate slaughterhouse. Laura held the line, standing firmly beside Ellen and reminding her that the executives were just weak, cowardly men who only cared about their spreadsheets.